Okay, hello, potentially lots or few people. We really don't know who is out there. So this is the Shipwrecks and Submerged Worlds MOOC discussion about ethics and maritime archaeology. We're going to begin by a slight apology in that we do have other people on the other side of the world who are trying to join in, but our technical capabilities are slightly letting us down. So Paul Johnson, Alexa Kansambis over in the US are waiting poised to be integrated, but we may have to take their comments via email and Twitter, but we'll try to get them integrated for everyone. So do please feel free to ask questions through either the YouTube channel or via Twitter, and we will answer them. But we also have a stock of questions which have come in through the FutureLearn platform. So we're just going to begin by introducing ourselves, and then we'll think about beginning the discussion around the questions which were posted on FutureLearn. So my name's Fraser. It's very nice to meet everyone online.
Peter Campbell.
Jeff Downer.
Ian Barefoot.
Crystal Safadi.
Julian Whitewright.
Helen Farr.
Daniel Newman.
Esther Vega.
Okay, so the first question that we posed on the FutureLearn platform, I'm just going to read off Peter's laptop to my right, so I'm not ignoring your, is that on the assumption that the best archaeological practice is pursued and any artefacts recovered are kept as one collection, is it legitimate for shipwreck excavations to be privately funded and privately housed? And really this touches on a couple of really related issues to do with the practice of archaeology and some core principles which underlie what many of us would see as archaeological practice. Now, just as sort of a caveat at the beginning, there's an important distinction to be made here between legal and ethical. And legal obviously relates to the varying codes of law around the world in different countries. And what is legal in some situations will be very different. Now, law prescribes one set of practice, but different groups of people subscribe to different ethical codes as well. And many of us here will be speaking from an archaeological point of view, which has a particular stance with regard to material culture and a shared heritage. And this influences our views, and we're very happy to debate that. So when we talk about right and wrong, this is often from an ethical standpoint, which we would take and are happy to explain, but may not coincide directly with a legal standpoint. So if there's any questions about that, do feel free to ask. So what do people think about funding excavations, because it is a challenge, and private collection in some respects?
Well, I'll hop in there, and certainly it's one of the big questions is how do we fund archaeological projects? And there have been for-profit models, but by and large they have not gone very well. None of the for-profit projects have done particularly well in terms of what we think about when we talk about archaeological ethics.
I think it's a very interesting question in itself, but the question specifically about should a project be privately funded and privately housed, I think it depends what privately housed means, actually. I don't have a problem with it being privately housed and paid for by a small admission fee if the public is then accessible to it, has access to it. But being privately housed, locked away somewhere for someone's private gratification doesn't seem right to me.
I think that's often a key thing that a number of us would pick up on, is it's about access and keeping a coherent collection of material, which is fundamental here. So private funding is welcomed in many respects in terms of helping if it's about releasing and promoting sort of scientific investigation. But the removal of materials into private collections, when the term private is about off limits, that's I think where many people become concerned, because that's acquisition rather than curatorship in some respects.
I think as well, as soon as we're talking about private acquisition, we're creating a monetary value to the objects as well. So that begins to get us into the problem that you're creating a market for these things. Yeah. And I mean, obviously one of the UNESCO rules was that cultural heritage shouldn't be commercially exploited. So we've got to bear that in mind as well.
It's a bit about the legacy of the collections as well, and sort of how long a private ownership can exist, and how long an individual or a group can sort of say they'll be able to take take stewardship of an object. And just because one group says we'll be able to take it, we'll be able to house it, we'll be able to provide access for academics and for the public to see it, doesn't mean that's always going to be the case.
I think one of the other big issues is if a project is being privately funded with the intention of recovering artifacts for private use, at what point does the recovery of the artifact outweigh the value of the archaeology itself? Because at the end of the day, the artifact is a lump of metal, a piece of wood. It's the context in which it's found within the site that's important. That's what tells us about the people who were there, who sad loss possibly created the site. So where do they disappear into the financial loss, if you like, or the financial background? That to me is the worry.
Yes, and certainly, so I'm from the American South, where in the 1950s and 60s, there was a rash of privately excavating Civil War vessels and creating private museums to house them. And the cost of underwater artifacts, conserving them and storing them and putting them on display is enormous. And what ended up happening in many of the cases there is that the public had to take over the burden, the financial burden and the care of it, and open public museums to house them, and ended up costing a fortune for the public.
What did the public think about that?
They were not happy. In fact, in a number of occasions, they tried to burn the shipwrecks to destroy them so that they wouldn't have to pay the financial cost. Some were buried, or now there's an overpass over one in South Carolina. So I mean, in some cases, we've lost those ships forever just because there was no long-term plan for the conservation and storage of these.
I always I talk to divers, I am one, and the way I always phrase it to them is, look, that piece of metal sitting on the seabed might be wet, cold and slimy, but it's happy down there. You bring it out and with the best will in the world, take it to a museum curator. You can watch the museum curator's face turn to a cheesy grin as he says, or she says, thank you very much. But at the back of her inner thought bubble over her head is, how much is this going to cost the museum? Leave it where it is. Tell somebody about it. Leave it where it is.
Unless leaving it where it is, of course, because it ends up being dredged up and thrown away by fishermen.
There is that to it. Absolutely.
Yes, it's a delicate balance.
Yeah.
I think there's something within there about who the ownership of the shipwreck is within in the first place, in terms of the private funding or the public funding and the accessibility of it. If it's deemed to be a site that is of, public value, and it's been preserved for the good of the public, or they might not think it's for their good, but it's there for them, like all the ones we have around the UK, and people are working on those, then there's a duty that should always be publicly accessible. I think, anyway.
A moral duty,
yeah,
yes,
I think both. And there's a huge amount of work that's gone on in Britain that is all in private collections, but those private collections are publicly accessible, either sometimes through a fee-paying museum, sometimes by arrangement. But there's a lot of different scales with it all, and equally there's a lot of work which has been carried out by public bodies that have been publicly funded, which is publicly inaccessible.
I think that's a very good point. And that brings us on to, we've actually got a question which has come online, which says, although I don't agree with illicit trading and treasure hunting, the searches that have been carried out by treasure hunters, in a way, provide substantial research and discovery otherwise not possible by scientists. And I think this is an interesting question because it's one that gets asked a lot. And I think there's a variability, because there is a baseline that the more survey that is done, the ocean's a big place, the more sites that are found. And there's a difficulty here in that actually we're seeing increasingly large amounts of offshore survey done for a number of purposes, offshore construction and so on, which are often integrated with archaeology in a very close way. So I think the argument that treasure hunting brings a huge resource to maritime archaeology that isn't there otherwise, I'm not convinced how legitimate that is in terms of the total area surveyed.
How many submerged landscapes of treasure hunters?
I think it's a very, so yeah, I'm obviously very biased in that for me, treasure hunt, there is no treasure in terms of the broad picture. For much of the periods that I'm interested in, and that is interesting, so the science approach to it there. But even with the wrecks, it would be, I honestly don't know, it'd be interesting to know the search areas considered, data released, and contribution to wider scientific knowledge, if that's the argument to be made, through that treasure hunting. And so I think it's an easy argument to make, but one that's very hard to back up with actual quantifiable data about improvement of the knowledge base in terms of total area.
I think, I'm sorry.
Okay.
I think for me, part of the problem is that there's just, there's a lack of communication. And so there's a lack of knowledge about how much treasure hunters could know, and how much people have discovered that they're not sharing. So it's a case of, while we do know some things have definitely been found, how much has been found and not reported. That's the difficulty.
Well, and unfortunately, we just don't have really good figures on any of this. Just as far as there actually are not that many treasure hunters out there. There's very few firms, both public and privately owned. Whereas you have state, regional archaeologists, you have commercial archaeology. If you look at a regular, average, run-of-the-mill commercial archaeology unit, they're running out and they're recording and surveying, vast amounts of shipwrecks per year. You look at most treasure hunting companies, and they're looking for one wreck specifically. Maybe finding, 1 or 2 a year. They're doing a very small amount of survey and recording compared to, your average commercial archaeology unit.
But what are they finding that they're just not interested in? And
That's
not
true.
saying,
Yeah. If they're looking for a
that's it.
specific wreck, they may
Exactly.
find other stuff as well.
I think also what skews the public opinion of what's going on in part is because the treasure hunters are looking for the glory wrecks, the famous wrecks with perhaps the bullion and things like that, the really famous ones. So of course, when they do find them, it hits the press and it becomes spread around media. So more people see it, it's more visible, whereas quite often the commercial archaeological units are doing really good work. They're recording important historic shipwrecks, perhaps scientifically important, but they're not necessarily going after those real glory finds. So it doesn't necessarily become international news.
Right. The ship graveyard surveys that record 60 or 100 wrecks don't get reported in the media, whereas, the search and possible discovery of one treasure ship, goes across CNN.
Yeah.
This also goes back to that question. If you think of some of the work that's been done in the Mediterranean, where huge amounts of the Mediterranean seafloor and the Black Sea have been systematically recorded with the same state-of-the-art kit that a treasure hunting company might be used, stuff like RPM's work at the Agadi Islands.
Yes, 250 square kilometers of
Ballard's work in the
Black
all
Sea, deep water
shipwrecks, 1600 years old with the mast still standing up. Phoenician wrecks off the Levantine coast. And there have been plenty of unsuccessful works that have been done as well. But so it is happening, and it is happening in a scientific context by people who are really well funded.
Yeah, I think the difference is there's been a huge development in technology which is now accessible by us, by archaeologists, through collaboration with industry. And before, up till maybe a decade ago, it actually was the treasure hunters who were privately funded who had this deep water investigative equipment. They had access to AUVs and ROVs. They were able to get down there, whereas now, today, if we want to get down there, we can also get down there. So the gap is really closed.
And not just through industry, but private organizations and universities, University of Malta, Woods Hole with Ballard's work, RPM. These are purely archaeological groups and surveying massive tracts of seafloor systematically.
In the case of operations like Woods Hole, industrially funded, in fact, by.
Well, yes, some of it, yeah.
But you go back to the work at Skirky Bank. Was that 1982?
Yeah.
Something like that, and that is deep water wrecks, ages before anybody was doing it. In that sense, with the ROVs, and just wasn't a pile of bullion on board. It was a pile of Samian ware and Dressel 2 to 4 amphora.
Fabulous.
Stuff like that.
Yeah.
Okay, so we found another interesting question. You're firing questions in at appropriate times when we're having discussions. This is good. Saying land-based archaeologists have had to deal with detectorists for a long time. Is there anything they've managed to do to find compromise that might work in the maritime discipline? And again, it's interesting. So this is perhaps contextually relevant to Britain in particular, where we have something that's called the Portable Antiquity Scheme. And here this has generated a huge amount of data from metal detectorists working in ploughed fields, which has sort of revolutionised our understanding of distribution of particular kinds of artefacts, so obviously metal artefacts, and extended our knowledge of them, in part through sheer weight of numbers of people being out. And it's established a framework where that knowledge and that material can be taken to a local expert. They will appraise it and say what it is, when it dates from, enter it onto our historic environment record, and fill in a report so it gets properly accessioned. In some ways, offshore, we have the receiver of wreck in this country who officially takes that line with items that are recovered. They have to be declared to the receiver of wreck. It's not geared up in the same heritage manner and has an unfortunate, in terms of heritage perspective, view about the monetary value of items. It's more difficult offshore in that there is, and diving wise, there is a link in terms of people can report material that they find from wreck sites and so on. But it doesn't feed through in the same way. And principally, I think it's because of the nature of the things you find. When you're metal detectoring across the surface, it's a bit like having submerged shipwrecks and your equivalents, which have been disturbed by material on the surface, and you're peeling off a little bit and going, oh, I found something, there might be something more significant. Whereas when we're working with other forms of offshore salvage, perhaps, which might come up against these things, it's a different order of magnitude in terms of investment and recovery. So I think on the one hand, the Portable Antiquity Scheme has been great. I really think it's added a huge amount to our understanding. And it would be really good if we can find a similar way to engage people, but perhaps with record things with a photograph and show local specialists what you found and have that data entered that way. Because then there's still the engagement, the improvement of the record. And for many metal detectorists, it's about the enjoyment of discovery, and we can participate in that, but also think about how we can use it to add data without perhaps leading to degradation of sites.
I think one of the problems is that I've worked in commercial archaeology companies with metal detectorists on discrete sites, and they're actually very useful. They, shame to admit it, but they do tend to find the tiny coins that the diggers have missed when they're in the spoil heap. The big problem is the underwater world, if you like, is very much a hidden world to everybody except the diver. And to a certain extent, it is discounted by the powers that be. What goes on under there isn't visible to the general public, therefore why worry about it? But of course, we're losing a huge resource. It is quite possible for a diver seeing an artifact, take a rough note of its location, and in fact report it to English Heritage, and it goes on the Pathscape site. But that, as a knowledge resource, is actually quite difficult to access, because a lot of the terms there are done in archaeology speak.
I think that's a really good point. I think it's been one of the really nice things for us doing the MOOC. It's been the level of interest. It's been really good to engage with this many people about a topic which you could think only interested a small proportion of people, but there's been thousands of people interested in shipwrecks and archaeology. And I think there is something that we've got to do about democratisation of knowledge and engagement of people. So yeah, you can use our favourite terms, and citizen scientists, and we're all used to these. Exactly, yeah, waving hands and things like that. But I do think it's got a really genuine point, because I think it's a more difficult thing when we talk about protection of a heritage that is less visible. It's easy with a barrow or an upstanding monument on land to help people make awareness of it, but it is remote from the vast majority of people, and we're asking for a considerable investment in some ways and leap of faith.
I mean, that said, I'll say, hand on heart, there has been a sea change, excuse the pun, in both fields. There are now a lot more white metal detectorists than what are termed night hawkers.
Yeah.
And similarly with divers, when I started diving in the very early 70s, I didn't bother with a weight belt because I had a sledgehammer, cutters, and everything else. I was down there with the rest of them. Now the ethics have changed in the dive groups. I have no doubt about that. Now I think I know one person who will still take bits. Everyone else is there on the look, don't touch basis. And I think that's brilliant. What they need now to do is look, don't touch, but please do tell.
Do you think that's somewhat related to the Nautical Archaeological Society and the training that people get there and its influence?
Jeff and I would certainly like to hope so.
I think it's actually, I'll jump in there. I think that it's partly the training, but that's of actually relatively few people in numbers terms, and it's quite a small operation overall in the UK and worldwide. I'm not sure, possibly even smaller. But I think what is very important, and the big benefit of that has been the way that the diving industry in general and the magazines and so on have picked up on the Nautical Archaeology Society. So I don't think it's influenced so much the people actually who are trained and members as we are of it. I think that the wider diving world see it through the articles and things. It's more of interest to them.
Well, the diving organisations as well, BSOC, PADI, they're all much more ethically focused now. They're always ethically minded, but I think there's a difference between mind and focus. And it's the ethos that's changed generally, and I think that's come from multiple directions. One of the things probably is television with the series, with the archaeology series that have been on there. It focuses people's attention on the subject.
Well, it's widely considered the Time Team has had perhaps the biggest influence in the UK, hasn't it? For all its faults, as we would see it.
When I came to this university to start my BA, I was a member of a class of 45. I was one of the 7 mature students on there. Most of the rest were there because of Time Team.
I think we. Sorry, were you going to say something?
I was just going to say that it's definitely this question of education which is going to make the difference, and it's not just through archaeological bodies, but the dive bodies themselves. So I've seen that PADI, for example, are doing their rec courses now, of course, as well, and it just helps people be more aware of what they're looking at and how to deal with material if it's found and it hadn't been recorded before. But not just the diving community. What came to mind were the trawlers in the North Sea. And there was a really successful program which gave these little classes to the fishermen to tell them what to look out for in terms of actual Pleistocene faunal material from the submerged Doggerland and Dogger Bank that was just being trawled up every time they went out. And they're bringing tons and tons of faunal remains up out of the North Sea. But it was just being dumped because no one knew what it was or how important it was. But with forms that went round and lectures that went round, suddenly the fishermen were coming in and they were filling out all contact sheets and they could actually pinpoint exactly where material was coming up. So divers and maritime archaeologists can go back and they can survey and hopefully possibly pinpoint whether there are sites and things like that, but at least it's getting recorded and it isn't just being brought up and then thrown away. So that's another example.
I think that's common even in sort of historical archaeology. I think if I remember rightly, Swanscombe site was actually found because an antiquarian went down there and asked it was in the 1800s, said, are you finding any unusual stones? Somebody said, oh yeah, we find these.
Well, there's an amazing resource. Dr. Rachel Bino, as she now is, recently just completed a PhD here looking at this, and there's a phenomenal record in the museums of things which people handed in because they did have this interest. They recognised it was value from the early 19th century onwards. And then there's a period of sort of disinterest where it went away. And then the re-education that Helen was talking about has really driven it again. So you could have read that data as though that it all got dredged up and the sea was bare and it stopped in about 1960. But actually it's just sort of a shift in interest. And then as soon as you start asking people again, then it's back again. And there is this richness to the material. So I think it goes both. The one, there's an amazing resource sat in museums, but secondly, there is a real power to enabling people to recognise what they're pulling up.
Yeah.
We have another question, which sort of ties in again. which is some of these reasons from Hurley books, saying, I know divers that jealously hoard the locations of wrecks because they don't want others to come and share it. But actually, an example from the Colossus, another wreck, is a good example of sharing and learning. And I think this is one of the things that we'd all push, is that it really is that change in how you value something, which is really important, shifting it from a monetary value or an exclusive value in terms of, I know wrecks that you don't know, to one where it's through the process of investigation that you gain additional knowledge, and that is where the significance of these materials lie and their potential does. And I think, again, this is where the diving agencies have actually really pushed this, because there's a whole suite of skills, and diving with a purpose has become one of these key elements. And if you think about the potential, the number of divers out there and the work we could do, it's just phenomenal.
That comes back a little bit to that question about the metal detector, and I think we've had our metal detector moment, maybe because it was the advent of scuba, and all of the sites that has uncovered, that was akin to people going out with.
Well, that's my favourite. I may have said this before now on a number of times. That's my favourite story for the empowerment of people, is that we were saying that, everyone focused on shipwrecks before, but I'm always dragging it towards the submerged prehistoric angle. But if you look at the discovery of a lot of the Danish submerged sites, they came from this public call for people to go and find an early site.
Find the oldest site.
Exactly. In the 1950s. And we would do this differently now. We wouldn't sort of ask people to just pull it out. We'd ask them to record it in situ. But the knowledge base that helped to generate transformed and has left a legacy that people are still working on today. So that is one moment of getting everyone engaged. And you can really see why globally this has a real potential in terms of a shared resource, because there are lots of people who now dive, and there are now lots of wrecks in different places that are accessible.
I think in the UK, it's really important to acknowledge the benefits of the licensee program, and how that really allows avocational maritime archaeologists to do some incredibly professional work, and to really have access to sites. And it's wonderful that that local divers are able to work on sites that they love, and to contribute to the archaeological knowledge of them, and to get support from English Heritage to be able to build their skills, and to just help for the knowledge.
For those of you who may be in different parts of the world that don't know, we have a system where our protected wrecks are given a licensee who is responsible for monitoring them. And this can anyone can apply to be the licensee and put forward that application. And that enables them then to carry out they can apply to do the survey work on it, and non-intrusive works, in very rare cases, if intrusive work is justified. And it has been a long-standing idea of engaging people. I think there's ways in which we could push it even further, really, and think about, as Julian said, drawing that thread from discovery, the excitement of being engaged, all the way through to dissemination, because that's the other issue.
It's where the system stops.
It is, and it's where we all struggle. Everyone struggles with this. Is the joy of doing it, but also the importance of saying that it's not enough just to find the things or to recover them. The really important thing is that documentation and release and opening up of that data as well, because it is a cumulative study, archaeology.
And there are divers who keep sites kind of under wraps. I wouldn't necessarily say hoard, but they keep things hidden from the general public and from other divers in order to protect sites. And certainly in the caving community, it's very important that people don't want to see caves destroyed or disturbed or looted, and so they keep sites to themselves. And so there are groups that agree to map caves and tell them what they've been finding and that sort of thing, while keeping the locations confidential for the sake of natural and cultural preservation.
It's also a safety thing, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well,
a fatality greatly affects the entire cave diving community.
Yeah.
But that happens in land sites as well. There's been a number of hoards in this country that have been unearthed, excavated. All the work's been done on them, and then it's been 6 months before they've been publicly made visible to stop people going and or discourage people from digging up the field looking for whatever else that might be there.
Within the PAS, the Fire Liaison Officer is quite entitled to mask the location of the site.
And we see this across the world. Different countries have different approaches to this in terms of whether it's possible to release locations of wreck sites for very good reasons. And there is no hard and fast rule, I think, and this comes back to this issue about ethics and management and how you can control it. And different countries have different approaches. Some take an open responsibility approach, this is what we see as an appropriate response to this material, and others take a more protectionist stance and say, once located, we'll either obscure the locations or physically mark and say you're not allowed within these zones. And this is why it is complicated, because there is no single answer to how you should ethically approach these. We have our ideas and arguments to support them, or ideas of value as well. And this is why I think it's important that discussion is had and very openly about this, because it will differ, but we have to be able to put forward strong arguments which people can then decide what they think about. Oh, we have another question. So is there an organisation that can make decisions if a site is in fact of archaeological interest? In the Mediterranean, we constantly find artefacts, and often we don't know if the artefacts are important. We should have a website to upload images to evaluate.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Or a national heritage.
So that's a really good idea and a really good question. What do people think or know?
Certainly in most countries, there is a central repository, or even in regions. So in the US, you have state archaeologists that are the central repository, and people can go look at their records or request records, and they keep track of everything that's found. In Greece, for underwater, there's the Ephorate of Underwater Antiquities. In Albania, there's the Coastal Authority. So most countries have a central repository where divers can report finds and where they keep a database.
I think it's the same too, isn't it?
Yeah, the superintendency. Yeah.
Yes.
And I think it's I think it's a really good idea, and it's a model that some of us would probably go for, where you have an open accessibility to upload and share and very rapidly, because then you could also have photographs of material in situ, which is what a lot of us would like. So you could take a photograph and say, this is what I saw. And this is where, again, you hit that sort of buffer between a desire for openness, which I think a lot of us would hope for, and the competing concepts of value which come with it. So how do you cope if you've found an amazing cargo of Mallorca or something like that, which has a value in a different economic sense as well? So I think it's a really good question. And
the fact that you haven't heard of these websites or organizations wherever you're based kind of speaks to how archaeology and governmental agencies need to communicate better that these facilities exist.
Yeah, this is what you do when you find something.
Yeah. The fact
that
have
to resort to Google.
Right.
It's also a very interesting question, actually, and very timely, because it's an example of where technology is helping you, the amateur diver, because with the advent of compact cameras, which a lot of us have got now, it's really very easy, and very many more divers can take very good digital photographs of things they find. And that actually speaks to the previous discussion we were having, because I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but it's entirely possible for them to take their photographs, upload them to a site without revealing where the site's, upload them to a website for identification, without revealing where the site is they took the photograph.
Yeah, absolutely.
If they wish to do so.
Quick plea though, please put something in it to act as a scale.
That's a very good point.
No, I think that's I think there's an awful lot in that as a potential. I mean, there's also a huge amount that can be done through time with crowdsourcing of underwater imagery as mapping, now that we've got increased computational power to do these things. So actually, there's lots of different routes where you could see engaging the diving community more broadly in heritage research. And so I think it's a really good idea, but it's one that would also, it has to overcome those issues of local practice and policy, really. And it does vary, and there are different cultural sensitivities to things. So yeah, a very good idea, I would say, but yeah, do you follow up?
We have a great question from Laura via FutureLearn, who asks, what do you think about reburying archaeological wreckage when a country's institutions cannot guarantee proper preservation? So in Buenos Aires, there's an 18th century Spanish trade ship that was found where there used to be a river, but it had silted over and it was excavated, and they didn't have the funding to preserve it and conserve it properly and put it in a museum, so it was then reburied in a different place. So what do you all think about that approach?
Personally, I think it's a perfectly sound approach, provided it's buried in an agreed place, which then will subsequently be built over.
And also, who it comes down to an ethical issue. Who decides that that particular country at that time is not capable of looking after its heritage? We've had examples in the recent past with Iraq and Afghanistan, where we know archaeological sites have been threatened or destroyed. Nothing's been done about it, but at the end of the day, who is standing outside saying that needs to be buried, and also has the, if you like, the legislative clout to do it?
Well, I think certainly lots of countries internally decide that they just can't deal with a shipwreck. Because as Peter said, the cost of conserving it and the cost of making it accessible to the public really is too much for lots of countries to be able to deal with. And in those cases, certainly detailed recording of the shipwreck and reburial is probably the best option that many countries have. Because
it's certainly better than destruction, isn't it?
Absolutely, and it's certainly better than taking it and watching it rot away.
And English Heritage will tell you it is the preferred option here.
I think there's a slight difference, isn't there, between just preservation straight in situ and the recovery, recording, and then reburial for the purpose of conservation.
Absolutely, I think it's quite different.
That's the important difference to make.
I think one answer with smaller artifacts for countries where they're under threat is send them out as a roadshow, as a permanent travelling exhibition. That A, keeps them safe, and B, can attract finances in for ongoing conservation.
I think it's something it could almost be seen as heretical, that you can say as well in this situation, is that not every shipwreck needs to be preserved for posterity once excavated, recorded, and documented. So the concept of preservation by record in archaeology is quite an established one. That's what we do with terrestrial sites. Once they're excavated, they are gone. And I'm not saying that in every situation this is acceptable, but there is actually a value to these materials as a learning aid that we can sometimes take on, that we don't have to preserve for perpetuity every frame and ship's timber, but that they don't necessarily, so we don't have to always be able to conserve forever. There may actually be a justifiable reason for excavation, recording in detail. And once that process is finished, removal and making it accessible as something that people can interact with or learn from as well. So I think the two things, I think it's a very complicated chain. I think preservation in situ demands, I think we might actually have succeeded in something there. Or is that you?
I think it's a separate
It's
goal.
for you.
We're obviously very au fait with the technology here, you can see that. So yes, we should apologise that we've failed to integrate our other Hangouts or Hangees, or whatever the term. So it doesn't sound entirely right, does it? But we will include them in a conversation in terms of answer to questions and so on. So Paul and Alexis, we really are thankful that you provided the time for this. I'm really sorry that we haven't been able to find the button to press to include you. And sorry to everyone else who's watching this, because it would have been very good to have their presence.
They are commenting though. So Dr. Alexis Katambis is a maritime archaeologist with the U.S. Naval Command. And in this whole discussion, he pointed out the USS Westfield, which was excavated. Everything was recovered. It was fully documented and studied. And subsequently, all diagnostic artifacts were conserved and kept, while non-diagnostic artifacts were reburied in a similar waterlogged environment. So that cut down the cost of conservation, and also people can go back and find it later if they need to look at any of the non-diagnostic artifacts.
Well, to a certain extent, we've done that here, of course, with the Gresham ship.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. She moved from a car park where she dried out in 6 months to the Navy's, or the Joint Services Diving School, where she floated until we dropped an anchor on it. But she's now actually in the diving centre at Stony Cove in Leicester. And anybody who wants to see a Tudor period merchantman is more than willing to go and look at her.
And I think that fits that sliding scale of things that we encounter archaeologically, and they're sort of the different things they can contribute once excavated. So I think it's true. So I don't think I don't think equally archaeologists should be painted in the light of people that always want everything kept in aspect and preserved, because actually we're on the reverse. We're actually very keen in the recovery of information from these things. So investigation, destructive investigation even, is a really important part of what we do, but it's always with a justification and a plan as to what happens next. So the example Alexis gives of removing and then thinking about how you conserve a hull which is complicated, but by placing it back in a comparable environment, is a really good one, because that's about removing objects which can be conserved and studied relatively easily, and then preservation of hull as well as a resource. So I think it's really good to see these range of options being put out there.
And although you've perhaps destroyed the original context by reburial, leaving it in sight, it does leave it open to an element of further interpretation at a later date. I mean, this happened with land sites like Butser, where they were dug in the 20s and 30s, reburied, and now they've been re-excavated. And new information, because of new technologies, comes around. So it's a great idea. It can just sometimes be frustrating.
And this ties quite nicely actually to a question we had by Twitter earlier today about whether people have sunk material to study degradation. And actually the answer to that is yes, by reburying. What it does give us is the opportunity to study degradation of the material and the site formation processes, which help us along the line with understanding conservation and also understanding how we can recognise sites because of, for example, things like scour pits and things like that in the future. So it is really important, and it's part of continuing the knowledge that we get about these underwater sites.
We have a question via YouTube.
Oh, we do, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, just one more thing. Alexis and Paul are very eager to contribute, so sorry that we can't pull them up, but just a bit more on the Westfield project. Alexis says that it was a mitigation project, which means they were widening the Texas City ship channel, so it had to be removed or else destroyed. He says that by non-diagnostic, they mean there were hundreds of small metal fragments that had no features or anything else, no inscriptions. And so those were all those extra bits were then buried in a similar environment to preserve.
I take it's just a Civil War site.
Yes, yeah, American Civil War.
This is one for you all to get your teeth into, from Robert Smith. The panel complains about artifacts in private collections not being seen by the public, but what about the masses of artifacts in museums that are documented but never on display? How about selling them off to raise money for new exploration and research?
It's a really good question, and it's tied into a very complicated, well, not a complicated issue, but a relatively straightforward one for museums, is that very few museums can actually do that. Even if they had made a decision that they would do that, they take on a responsibility to care for those objects. Now, it is interesting that it's a tiny percentage of material at some museums that's on show, and I think it's a very fair thing to say that it'd be good to be able to see more of it, and
you can see it
if you ask.
Bang on the door and ask.
Exactly.
If you know it's there in the first place.
Increasingly now you get all the catalogues online. So all of the stuff in, say, Greenwich, for example, all of their catalogues of ship plans are online. They're available. Most of them are digitised. You can actually whistle them up electronically. So it's hard to know that it's there, but it is so much more available than it was 10 years ago.
Sorry, Peter.
Well, I was just going to say, museums weren't designed to be a public, a weekend trip. They're designed to be repositories. So what they show is actually a very small amount, 10% or less, in some cases 1%. They're archives. And so, and as public institutions, you can go request to see any of the artifacts. Just because it's not on display doesn't mean that you can't ask to see them. So they're designed in order to, one hand, draw in the public, but the vast majority of their budget and people working there and everything else is for as a repository, as an archive.
And I think that's something that doesn't get pushed enough, is they are fundamental in terms of archaeology. As a practice, as archaeology, we need these archives for comparative purposes, and they're a really substantial investment, but a fundamental tool for what we do. And it's taken a long time for us to build those up, and it's hard to overestimate the value of it to us.
I think it's also important to remember that museums change their displays, and that just because something isn't on show once doesn't mean it will never not be on show. And that's one of the brilliant things about going to museums. I mean, there's some museums I've been to probably dozens of times. A, because they're so vast, and B, because there's always a new show on. There's always new objects on display, and that's one of the things that makes them so interesting and so wonderful for repeat viewers.
So just very quickly on a slight side tangent, but to go back to the reburial question, Hurley Books asks, do you add something to the rebury site to let future archaeologists know that this is an anomaly?
Hopefully.
It's a very good question.
Yeah.
And I think it would vary in different parts of the world, but in nearly anywhere I've heard of it, it would have to be because you're introducing a potential as a shipping element. It would normally be recorded as an activity and either a hazard or a feature on the seabed floor. But you are right, you could possibly imagine situations where it would be a confusion given enough time.
Nowadays, of course, in the UK, the Marine Management Organisation would have it on record.
Absolutely. But you can imagine the time depth we had, give ourselves 1,000 years, and change in recording systems, the difference between ourselves and the Romans, etc., etc. And you can see it might be a puzzle to someone, but hopefully archaeologists would be interested in the future, would be interested in why did they do this and how effective was it? So, not a stupid question, a good question.
But the Gresham ship in Stony Cove in England is an interesting example of that, isn't it? Because you can see in 1,000 years, people go and think, well, how did a Tudor warship get in there?
Exactly, yes.
Where did it come from?
The general practice is to lay a geotextile or something modern at the lowest point. So anytime you add something into the environment, before you add it, you add something down below. And anytime you dig a hole, you put something like a 2014 coin down there, so that people who come later know that archaeologists were there and changed the site. Good question.
I've also been on sites where everybody involved has signed the bottom of a rock, put it at the bottom of along with an apology for getting there first. So yeah.
That probably wasn't planned.
In fact, actually, there's a very long archaeological history of this. Pitt Rivers, one of the early archaeologists in Britain, had his own medallions cut that he used to place in the base of his excavations, and it's always been a dream of mine that sometimes I'll find that he was there before me. But there you go.
Gold medal of honor.
Yeah.
Do we have some more questions? Let's see.
We do. What was the second question on the FutureLearn? Okay, so it sort of ties into the first question that we picked up, which this one was posted on the site saying, in an attempt to raise revenue to fund maritime archaeological projects, would it be ethically right that the artifacts recovered from shipwrecks, for where there were duplicate examples, once all originals have been thoroughly recorded and conserved, being loaned out to the general public for a fee? And it's
Classic question.
It is. What do you think, Julian?
I don't know. It's a really, really difficult question. It has happened in this country. In Britain, HMS Invincible, which was one of our protected wreck sites, was excavated in the 1980s, and they found a huge amount of the ship's stores had been preserved on the site and were raised, and a selection of them was sent to Chatham and put in the museum there, and remaining duplicates and everything was sold off after they'd been recorded. So there are precedents for doing it in Britain within a system of licensees run by the government on protected wreck sites, but it's still a really difficult thing because your approaches may change in the future, and we might want to go back and look at all those things from a different perspective, and we can't because that archive has been dispersed.
Yeah.
But then you could say that by selling off those artifacts, they were able to continue the work on the site, which wouldn't have happened otherwise, and we found out more information because of what has gone on. I don't know.
Sorry. The other element of this actually goes hand in hand with the CITES legislation, the protection of endangered species. The argument there against the legalised sale of ivory is that it will act as a cover for the illegal sale of ivory. And if you are getting artifacts purporting to come from one shipwreck on sale, there is absolutely or very difficult to stop it being artifacts from another shipwreck, and we'll just encourage looting.
I think that's a really strong argument. I think as an archaeologist, keeping completely out of adding any monetary value to cultural heritage is a very important part of what we do, because this has been an argument that's been around for a long time now in terms of what we should do, but by enabling any form of added value to be given to this material, we feed into that market, because you drive those economic levers, really. I think the question was asking a more complicated thing, in that saying, is it okay for these things to be loaned out as display articles and to charge them? And that I don't have a problem in some ways, in terms of if collections are maintained, managed.
It's keeping the artifacts together, because it comes back to this idea of commercial exploitation. Well, we're commercially exploited every time we go to a museum and pay money to get in there. You could argue.
Exactly.
Somebody is paying a fee. And where does that fee go? Is it
Conservation.
I don't know, shareholders up in penthouses, or is it to maintain the collection and work on it and investigate it and preserve it for the future?
Well, that actually ties back into Robert's question from before, is if you apply to go to a museum to research a piece that's in the archive, you get in for free. But if you're going in just to look at the collection that's on display,
Enjoyment.
then you have to pay. So
Even though you paid for the museum's real taxes, if it's in your own.
that's true. Yes, that's very true. Yeah.
And that was a very interesting thing here, when a number of museums became free. It was very interesting to see the impact in terms of changing use of museums. It was very good. We've had another.
Well, actually, real quick. So Dr. Paul Johnson at the Smithsonian, who unfortunately is one of our experts who's not appearing on the screen, he says that this public loan of artifacts for a fee was actually tried in South Carolina in the US. And it didn't work, unfortunately, because people moved and they died, they lost interest, and some people were robbed. So it simply didn't work out, unfortunately.
I guess one thing to think about is the question of insurance of being loaned an artifact. If you've got to maintain it and you've got to keep it, obviously we don't want to create a value, monetary value, but these things do obviously have a value, and the conservation itself has a value. So how would it be insured?
Well, it's the same when museums loan artifacts to other museums across the country. They are insured, and you could do probably the same with private displays.
And art galleries as well.
And art galleries, shows, whatever.
I tend to argue there that if, as a curator of one museum, I accept material from another, I accept the responsibility of curating it properly. The thing that worries me about dispersal of artifacts to the general public, they don't have that background, they don't have that expertise, and in fact the artifact could degrade. All right, if you're talking about a coin, probably not going to happen, but if you're talking about any other material, wood, clothing, you've got serious conservation issues.
Well, definitely you need to develop a concept for that. So, but it's an idea, which
a high-profile example for as far as museums would be the moon rocks. So when NASA brought back moon rocks, they distributed rocks to museums all around the world, to state museums and local museums, and by and large, many have gone missing and are unaccounted for.
22 kilos.
Yeah. So nobody knows what happened to them. So really interesting. Should we address
there's a comment on YouTube
about the Roman legends for this?
Oh, yeah.
Dr. Katsambas brings up an interesting. Oh, sorry.
That's okay. I was just saying that there's a comment on YouTube from Robert Smith following the previous question. He thanks us for the answer, but he's still not convinced that there are not artifacts that can be sold. So replicas are often put on display as they are in his local Finland museum, and the originals are elsewhere despite them being discovered locally.
That is a constant issue in terms of distributions between national and local museums, and it is very difficult in terms of arguments about where things are, what accessible means and which audiences they're reaching, and also the importance of authenticity. So does it have to be the original artifact? Is a replica a suitable stand-in for the real thing in an archaeological world? And it's a really complicated issue in terms of what people think about it. And generally like to see things in terms of close to their context of discovery, but that's because I'm very fortunate and I do get to travel and I have a privileged position in that way. But I can see the argument that you want to open things up to as many people as possible, and therefore moving them to a large centre which increases their visibility is a valid way to go forward. So I don't think there's, well, I think we're all probably going to disagree on this
It becomes complicated with shipwrecks as well, which might be found in one place, but are actually from a totally different end of the earth or place. I've also been to a lot of museums in North America and Mexico that have had some brilliant reconstructions of huge sites like the Lascaux cave paintings and Egyptian carved temples and things, which people are in that museum who probably are never going to get to the other side of the world, and it's much better to see that in some kind of full-size setting, I suppose, than a little postcard or a picture in a book or something, just as a way of understanding the scale of things. So I think there is definitely a place for replicas and reconstructions and that kind of thing in museums.
I think the importance is just that they're labeled as such, and that it's and that they're acknowledged that that's what it is. And as long as people aren't trying to pass off a reproduction as the original, I don't have a problem with it either. I think it's a great engagement tool.
And I think people also focus on the discussions around those sorts of objects tend to focus on the rare and the exceptional. But I think there's also a lot that can be done with the mundane. I think part of the real joy of doing archaeology is contact with material, and the importance of context isn't just an abstract thing. It's actually the joy of seeing things in their relationship to other things.
Absolutely.
And I think there's a lot. I think the museum touch tables and things that people engage with are actually really valuable. So in some ways, I don't know, but maybe we're a different group of people than in terms of because of what we do in terms of going into museums. But I'd be happy with seeing less overtly special things, and some of our curator friends are going to disagree with this, but also having more things which are the day-to-day stuff that you can engage with. Because
we've still got an element of cabinet of curiosities rather than the feely touchy bit, which is what everyone relates to.
I think there's something very special about seeing and being in the presence of the original, especially when it's got some age to it. If you're actually there and it's the original thing and you think, gosh, it's been 1,000 years or a couple of 100 years since this was used, and that's amazing.
But that's human nature, isn't it? I mean, it's even more special to be the first person to find it.
Exactly.
Than on some Roman shipwrecks.
Or the first person to touch it as well.
The first person for 2,000 years.
So
Nothing like it.
There is that.
So Dr. Katsemis had an interesting, he brought up an interesting case that happened recently whereby there was a Roman cargo carrying, amongst other things, a bunch of lead bricks as ballast. And it was recently used for a particle shield at a scientific laboratory. So they took the bricks, they were stamped, they cut off the area with the stamps and saved the stamps, and then used just the blank lead parts. They melted it down and made it into a particle shield. So how do you all feel about that? It's destroying an artifact, however, they were duplicates.
Did they pay money?
I don't.
Is Roman shipwreck archaeology better funded?
I don't believe so. I believe it was from one state agency to another state agency.
I do remember that.
Do they know where the lead came from?
Yes, they did a full analysis of all the ingots.
But this encapsulates this last 5 minutes discussion, doesn't it? Because what they've done is exactly what we were discussing, which is hopefully done all the archaeology, got all the knowledge and information out of it, and then actually destroyed the artifacts. And do we agree with that?
And save the representative.
There's something missing there. We've got all the knowledge out of it, available using the technologies of today.
Right. You never know.
100 years down the road.
Yes.
I think
so. What else can we get?
Well, a great example of what you just said is that we've been doing lead isotope analysis for many years, and it wasn't until the last 5 years that the National Oceanographic Center here pioneered what they call a double spike method, which is far more accurate than all the previous examples. And so you have this large error from lead isotope analysis prior to this that actually wasn't very accurate. And now we actually can get down to the mine where it came from. So if lead artifacts are gone and have been destroyed, then that information is gone forever. So who knows what methods we'll have in the future.
Absolutely. That's the big issue.
Yeah.
I think that's it, and I think that's in terms of representative samples. How much is a representative sample?
Yeah.
These things are. It is really difficult, especially when you're dealing with difficult resources, which also have an environmental impact in terms of extraction. It's a really complicated sort of confluence of issues in that respect, and I can certainly have a degree of sympathy with the preservation of percentage. I like the idea of the removal of the stamps in terms of diagnostic features and samples from those materials. Yeah, so I'm not unsympathetic to it as an entire project, but it is an interesting one.
So if they've got the stamps, then they can still do advanced isotope analysis on that. So.
I actually think it's furthering science in two different fields. I think that I'm actually okay with it. And I'm one of the most ardent, archaeologists there is.
Is there a display next to the particle shield?
Well, I'm sure there is, and I really hope there is. But I think you're right. I think there's this other part of archaeology that I think often we don't do so well at transmitting to the wider world, is that we're also often more happy with the continued state of material, that we encounter something in a particular point in its trajectory as material culture, but actually that's a continuation. So its entry into a museum collection is actually only part of that, and then there might be changes 100 years, 200 years, however many thousand years down the line, and that actually we don't expect things to be static in that sense. And so we're perhaps more flexible than people imagine, but it doesn't change our ethical standpoint. So I think this is where sometimes people feel that we're playing fast and loose, but actually they are different things in terms of what happens to material and the justification and reason for it.
There has to be a judgment call, doesn't there? I mean, in this example about the lead blocks, I mean, I'm sure we can all, from a professional and interest perspective, realise there's a limited amount of knowledge that you might ever wish to gain from 600 lead blocks.
And actually, something that I forgot to mention is that you can't just use any lead. It's not like there's other lead available for them to use, because lead on the surface has background radiation from the nuclear bombs that have gone off since Hiroshima.
Pre-Hiroshima.
Right, so it has to be buried under the water since before then. So very limited supplies of this, and so it was quite important for the particle shield that this come from a source.
That's something that's made 20th century vessels underwater actually quite valuable as a resource, because if they're pre-1944, their steels don't contain any radiation.
That's right.
Okay, we're actually drawing to, unbelievably, an hour has passed of conversation. Well, I suppose we have one quick question which we should answer from Kevin Murphy, as he put something in. And his is, what happens to shipwrecks that have been unearthed due to the storms at the beginning of the year, also winter storms, wherever you are? Does this not disrupt the site and destroy, remove the contextual interest material that we're interested in? And is it still worth excavating these sites? And again, this is sort of a grey area, in that I think we'd always say that storms are interesting because they can expose, they of course can damage, but we don't know the degree of disruption. And just to say that something's been moved by natural processes doesn't mean that we can't construct archaeological significance from the material and their redistribution. There's always something that we can learn from these things. So it might look very destructive, but actually we can often find really valuable information from it. In fact, I have some students looking at the impact of storm surges on vessels at the moment, because it is really interesting, and it has lots of impact from both what could we get from excavating, but also in terms of preservation.
I mean, there was an interesting example on the course from the East Winner Bank.
Absolutely, as Julian knows very well, yeah.
Yeah, that wreck we didn't know, nobody knew it was there. Totally new vessel, and that was exposed in a different way and is now reburied again. Actually, I think a piece of it has come up again. So I've got to go and look at it again next week. But other bits of it are scattered around the sort of countryside nearby, which have lost a bit of meaning because you don't know if they're actually from that vessel. But the main coherent structure, in some ways it was almost perfect, because it came up, we had a brief chance to go and learn about it, identify it, and now it's buried again.
I would say,
protected.
I'll say, Kevin, if you know of a site like that, get some mates and take a tape measure out there and a pad and record it.
Lots of photographs.
Lots of photos.
In North Carolina, in the Outer Banks, there was a ship that came up during a storm, popped up, and it was just a keel section and a few frames, and they were actually able, East Carolina University went down with students and recorded, and they're actually able to reconstruct, figure out which ship it was based off the ship construction and the fasteners, And I believe it's the oldest ship found in North Carolina. It's an early 17th century Royal Navy vessel. They're able to reconstruct everything that happened to it. They knew that it had disappeared near there, but they were able to kind of reconstruct this entire story of this Royal Navy vessel that went down off North Carolina just from a few bits of timbers that popped up out of the sand.
Well, in which case, I think we will draw things to a close. I hope this has been of interest to people watching, and I can only apologise to Paul and Alexis for their time and their lack of video telepresence, but we'll try and make sure that we find ways to correct things if we ever do this again. And thank you all for your questions, and yes, I hope we answered them.
Bye-bye.
Bye, folks.